Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we're going to look at what John's dream solutions for fixing boxing and MMA might be. John, how the hell are you?
Good. I have a little friend here today with me. She's going to help me record this episode or really distract me. One of the two. We'll find out.
Would that be your new cat?
It's not my cat. It's Isla, but yes, it's a cat. It's not mine though. But maybe. I mean, I have to do everything for it. But yes, it's not mine.
Listeners, this is his cat. This ex-girlfriend of his or current girlfriend or whatever you want to term them left this cat with him in January and he still has it. This is his cat. If you agree, leave us a note in the comments. It's his cat.
And if you do agree, I'm going to block you.
He won't know. Just sign in with a different account and just picture things.
I don't even know how to respond to the reply to the comment section yet. I'm still working on that. The substack stuff's very confusing to me.
So, John, I have a question. We recently watched Canelo Alvarez fight a mandatory of all things and make $33 million. Now, we said that we were going to give your dream solutions for fixing boxing and MMA. So let's go ahead and start with boxing. What are the major problems afflicting boxing? I mean, Canelo just made $33 million. Is boxing that broken?
Well, I guess from people's point of view, people always argue that boxing's broken because we don't get the fights we want to see. We don't get the big fights. There's some truth to that. Even the Canelo one. I mean, John Ryder was a mandatory, so he made some money, but was he really the best, the number one challenger in that weight division? There's some questions that, and it all goes to the sanctioning organizations. The major problem with boxing all bubbles down to the sanctioning organizations. People want to blame. You see always these articles written like the problem with boxing, and they talk about the promoters and the broadcasters, but those entities, by design and purpose, they're there to make money for themselves. Broadcasters are there to get ratings for their network. Promoters are there to make money for themselves. In fact, they're in an adversarial position with the fighters. That's legally they're considered an adversarial position. They want to pay fighters as little as much and keep as much money. So their purpose is not the health of the sport. But the entity that, if you read their bylines, you read the purpose behind them, that is supposed to look out for the health of the sport, that are supposed to be objective and not have favoritism or anything like that, are the sanctioning organizations. But the sanctioning organizations, I think, fail miserably at their job. What they're intended to do is they're intended to be, by purpose and legally, is to be objective in their ratings. In other words, rate people where they're based objectively through data, through just objective observation, rate them, and then have guidelines about what is required of their champions. But they don't really do that. And so you get this problem where they do it sometimes, and the idea that because there's an independent ranking and an independent title, that's very beneficial to the boxers because they can own the title, they can use it for leverage to get more money, right? As we see with Canelo, with other boxers, we can see that's why the top boxers make so much more than the top MMA fighters. They're not forced to sign with the promoters to get a chance to fight for the title. I mean, sometimes they are, but there's rules against that with the Ali Act. But because those sanctioning organizations, they don't stick 100%. You see a lot of boxers get screwed over. They have to sign with a promoter that knows how to work the system and bribe the sanctioning organization. They don't get ranked as high as they wanna. And also because some guys know how to play the system and how to pay out the sanctioning organizations, sometimes you get boxers who get a title and then are not required to defend it. And so guys that are waiting for their opportunity for the title shot and have spent their life, and the title shot is where they can get their more renown and make more money, they're left hanging because they don't get the title shot. In fact, we kind of saw that with Canelo, where he didn't defend his titles for a while and they gave him a waiver. We see that with, there's Fury there's no obligation for him to defend it. They're not making them. Because it happens, it really hurts some boxers. And so that to me is the biggest problem, is that the sanctioning organizations, the people that are supposed to make boxing a sport, everybody else, it's prize fighting. For the promoters, it's prize fighting. For the broadcaster for the fighters. They're there just to make money. The sanctioning organization's job is to put some sort of structure in the sport that you can rise through the ranks. The best then can rise to become a mandatory or whatever to the top of the ratings. And that when you're the champion, you have obligations to defend, and they don't enforce that. And that to me is the number one problem in boxing.
I have a question for you, sir.
Fire away.
Step aside money. Is that a boon or a hindrance to boxing? And please explain what step aside money is.
Well, what step aside money is let's say you have a fighter and you have an opponent that's been declared a mandatory by the sanction organization. So you're the champion. A opponent has been declared a mandatory. You have to defend within a certain number of months against this opponent, or you're going to lose your title, or they're going to declare also a purse bid. But you don't want to fight them because you have another bigger fight that you can do, and maybe that guy is just not a big enough draw. You can go to that fighter and say, we're going to pay you some money to step aside for now as a mandatory. So you're not the man. We don't have to defend against you immediately, and I can do this other fight. Now, it's a boon in some ways because it is beneficial that if there's a big fight, a big money fight, and it helps fighters in the sense that they can have big money fights, they make more money. It also helps in the sense that big money fights probably draw more fans and grow the sport. And stepping aside and paying another opponent a step aside fee can be good for them because they make money. And sometimes there's some guys who actually make a living out of that, getting the step aside money. And many of them often think that some of them are people that they assume would never beat the champ, but because the fight would sell so little, it's better for everybody if he gets paid off. But I think as much as I think step aside it has a purpose, I think there has to be a limit to it, like a one-time step aside or something, because the problem with it is boxers will do whatever they can never to defend the title, and they'll stretch it out because they also can threaten the opponent. If you don't take the step aside money, I don't want to fight you. I'm going to relinquish the belt. And because that fighter with the title is the one that generates all the money, the other fighter is just going to kind of says, okay, I'll keep accepting the step aside because I don't want to go into, some sort of tournament mode or whatever to crown the new title. And also whoever I fight afterwards, there's no money going to be involved. You're the guy that generates the money. So there is that. But I see its purpose in some ways because you do sometimes want to make big fights. But, I guess when we get down further in what my dream scenario is, I'll talk about what I would do about that. But for now, I would like to cap the amount of time you can do a step aside. I mean, I think you have an obligation. You have to defend against the mandatory eventually.
There's a good scenario of this that I was wondering if you could break down for us, and that's George Kambosos Jr. Could you talk about him and step aside money and how he did not?
He did not step aside?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, George Kambosos Jr., the Aussie, he was the mandatory, and really, well, we should get into is actually kind of a plot by him and Teofimo Lopez.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly.
They had a thing where Teofimo Lopez Kambosos was declared the mandatory, and Top Rank was not interested in the fight, but Teofimo Lopez's team and Kambosos' team kind of colluded, I guess is the right way to say, to force it that the negotiations couldn't get settled to have the fight or to pay him off for step aside. So it went to a purse bid. And because it went to a purse bid, Triller bid a huge amount of money. And so that was their ploy to make, because they knew Triller had the money and they were going to get a huge amount of money. But then Triller ended up not being able to carry off the fight because a bunch of reasons, because they're incompetent, but also because of the COVID pandemic, and that fell through. But they got a big chunk of the money that the 20% that Triller had to set aside went to them, so they made money on it, and then it went to the next bid. And so they did eventually have that fight, but because Kambosos refused the step aside money, which was, I think, part of the ploy with Teofimo. I don't think they really wanted it, but because of that, he ended up getting a shot at the title as a mandatory, even though he wasn't a big name at the time. There were other bigger names. He got a chance at the mandatory, got this big money, and he won the belt and upset Teofimo Lopez. And he got even more money when he defended against Devin Haney.
Wow. What are the major problems with MMA?
Well, in many ways, MMA is kind of the flip side of the coin. The major problems with MMA is we have promotional titles in MMA. There's no independent bodies with titles and rankings. So the promoter controls those. And we know through the history of boxing, and we also know from the hearings of the Ali Act and everything, is that leads to monopoly in the industry. Promoters, because they can force you to sign coercive contracts with them to get title shots, they can line up and basically force a division, all the top fighters in one weight class, to sign under them. And then they're all signed exclusive contracts with that promoter. So although the promoter even has more leverage, because not only did you have to give up your rights to get a chance at the title, but now you win the title, the next guy has to give up his rights to fight for the title. And so it suppresses wages. It limits the leverage that the fighters have. And that's what we have in MMA. So we're in boxing. The problem is the sanctioning organizations don't follow the guidelines. And so you have this kind of corrupt system. The reverse is we have the promoters own the titles, and they have the ability to set up the fights that the fans want to see and get the big fights made, but they're big fights for the promoter. The boxer, the fighter, in this case, the MMA fighter, is cut out of the revenue generated because they have to concede all the rights to get into that promotion.
All right, I have a question.
Fire away.
You mentioned corruption a lot with boxing. Is there corruption on that scale in MMA?
Well, in some ways, but we don't need corruption in MMA. In boxing, because you're forced, there's legal laws separating a promoter and a sanctioning organization have to have a separation between them. A promoter cannot compensate a sanctioning organization. There's separation. You need corruption to influence the sanctioning organizations. You have to bribe them. You have to do all this other stuff. Since a promoter owns their own title, there's no collusion. There's no bribery, because the promoter can just say, I'm not going to give you a title fight, even though you deserve it, because I own that title. So because you cut the collusion necessary in boxing, the bribery necessary, it's been cut out because we cut out the middleman. The promoter owns it. So yeah, in MMA, I would say we don't have that kind of corruption, but it's because it's unnecessary, because the promoter already has the power to even do more than they do in boxing, because they don't even have to bribe it, and yet they can screw people over, step over them on the man. There's no such thing as a mandatory. There's none of those things. They can determine whoever they want to fight.
Is there corruption in other senses outside of, the sanctioning organizations with MMA?
Well, I do think you could argue that there's corruption with the managers. Because as we've talked before, managers serve as brokers. Now, there's also corruption in boxing managers and stuff. We've long history. There's mob influence. We have Daniel Kinahan and influence, but he's also influencing MMA. But in MMA, the corruption is again more underhanded. It's not directly. Mm-hmm. It's more of a quid pro quo, in that a manager, even though he's supposed to, as a fiduciary duty, to look out for the best interest of his fighter, often doesn't look out for the best interest, because his best interest is taking care of his buddy, the promoter, who has all the power. And so, yeah, you could argue that's a form of corruption, because the manager is now more concerned about what the promoter thinks of him and appeasing the promoter than he does his own fighter. And the promoter rewards that manager because they keep their fighters in line and have them do exactly what the promoter wants.
What is the number one thing you would do to fix boxing?
Well, that's a good one, because I think the number one thing to do is basically what we talk about the sanctioning organizations. Make the ratings more objective. If the ratings are more objective, right, then the fighters that deserve it, the boxers that deserve it, would rise through the ranks and rise to the top. And then you would have people that put their life, all their energy into being a fighter, spent all this time, they would be rewarded. Now, sometimes it would be a negative for the fans, because the guys that would rise to the top of the ratings isn't the fighter that we would want to see the most. But I think it would be the best overall, would be the best, because in the long run, we talk about boxers having more leverage. They would even have more leverage here, because the promoters, opposing promoters, couldn't counter their rise in the ratings by bribing a sanctioning organization, by using their own influence. And on top of that, beyond the ratings being more objective, have the title obligation strictly enforced. So that goes hand in hand with that. The ratings are objective. We rate people based on their actually objective wins, the rating, rising in the ranks. And on top of that, when you win a title, here are the rules you have to do to enforce to hold that title, and you have to do it. And so you're if you're going to be a champion. Now, what's good, what I like about that is I don't think boxers should be made to fight. Like MMA always say, it's great because the UFC can make the fights we want. They can force people to fight. I don't think we should be forcing fighters to fight. If a fighter doesn't want to fight someone for whatever reason, they shouldn't have to. But if you have a championship comes with obligations. That means you have to fight the number one mandatory challenger. You have to, or you're stripped. Now, if you don't want to fight them, then step aside and drop the title. That's 100% fair. Ryan Garcia and Tank Davis, there was no title on the line. They made a ton of money. They should be allowed to do that. Canelo Alvarez is a big star. Mayweather was a massive star, didn't need the belt. But some fighters need that title to make money, to actually sell a fight, to get renown and attention. And I think it's unfair that big name fighters that could probably sell without the title, that we let them, because the sanction organizations love the fees they collect from the bigger fighters that sell more, we let them hold on to a title and deny other people. So that would be my big fix. The big problem, the number one thing we could do to fix it. Now, how do we do that? That's the question. How do we do that?
May I ask a quick question, sir?
Go ahead.
When you're talking about those titles, would Andy Ruiz be a good example of a fighter that needed a title?
100%. I mean, look what happened to Andy Ruiz. Because the original opponent for Joshua fell apart in New York and they had a limited number of opportunities. I mean, because the sanction organization have rules who's eligible to fight for the title, they had a limited number of fighters. Basically, I think it was Luis Ortiz and him as the only ones that could meet the requirements for Joshua's titles. And so they could ask for a ton of money. Ortiz wanted more because he had a potential Wilder fight too, so he had options. But Andy Ruiz got, because of the independence of the titles, because the rules say you have to fight him, he got $5 million. But because he beat Joshua and upset him, because he got that opportunity to fight him, in many ways lucked out on that opportunity, got that opportunity to fight Joshua, beat him, he's now kind of a well-known boxer that's a draw. I mean, part of the problem is he wants a lot of money every fight, so it limits his opportunities a lot, but he's making a lot more than he did before. And so that's what a title does, because Andy Ruiz, I mean, he was a known heavyweight. He was something of an attraction, but became a big name and well-known heavyweight and a big attraction because he won the belt. And so you would love to see guys that are grinding get that chance to fight for the belt.
All right, I have another question. UFC making the fights people want, being known for that. Boxing having mandatories. Which one would you say, in your personal opinion, is the bigger meritocracy? And we use that word a lot, but I mean, who is putting on the more meritorious fights?
Well, it's an argument it's hard to say that either one's is the clear-cut winner, because in some ways with the UFC, because everybody's trapped in the UFC and they have a kind of a tiered system as you rise to the ranks, there is a lot of meritocratic matchmaking because people rise and they get the title fight. They decide you've won the most fights, you're beating everybody else in that division. You get to basically, they run a nonstop tournament. And because it's self-contained in the promotion, you have more guys rise, but the leverage is completely taken out because they don't have to offer you that fight. There is no mandatory. They don't have to. So you have to cave in at the last minute to get that title fight, right? You have to, if you don't take the offer the UFC is saying, they can skip over you. So even though there's most matchmaking, most bouts, most title fights are pretty meritocratic in the UFC, we would say this is the guy that deserves it. The problem is at the end, the fighter still has to cave in and loses out on the reward of being able to cash in on being a champion, of being able to leverage that, of getting a piece of the pie, a big piece of the pie of the money they're generating. Now in boxing, we have a mandatory. And a mandatory is pretty meritocratic because you rise the ranks, they declare a mandatory fighter. The difference is because there's not one promotion self-contained, there's a bunch of fighters floating in from different promotions, each The sanctioning organizations try to limit who can be rated in each organization, because if you're a champion, you're not rated. If you're in a title fight with another promotion, you're not, another sanctioning title, you're not rated. So it takes a lot of fighters out of the rating. So some of the best fighters are often not rated on those sanctioning lists, those sanctioning ratings. And so often some of the guys rise to the top and you wouldn't say that's the best guy. But the mandatory system, by declaring a person when you rise to the top, you get a shot, that really preserves their leverage. They don't have to cave in to all those demands, because the promoter's not gifting them the title shot. This third party, the sanctioning organization, says they are the mandatory, they're the required challenger for the title, and you have to negotiate with them.
Sanctioning organizations, commissions, let's say they don't want to do something. Is there another solution?
So let me go back and just add the thing about fixing boxing. So, because as I brought up before we get in that sidebar, that very interesting sidebar, what can we do about it, right? What can we do about it? Well, one thing is we could ask have the sanctioning organizations enforce the rules, right? And the ABC, we could have force them to do it, but neither one really will do that. We know the sanctioning organizations have their problems. They don't follow the guidelines that they said they would follow. They don't do what they basically pledge they do when they pass the Ali Act. And even though we've granted the ABC, the Association of Boxing Commissions, some authority into making compelling them to do it, the ABC has no interest in really enforcing it, because the ABC, they're much more interested in keeping promoters happy, so they show up at their individual commissions, their individual states and regions, and spend money there. So they're not going to force the sanctioning organization to do what they want. But since sanctioning organizations, commissions won't do it, there is another solution, and that's congressional action. So the number one way we can fix boxing to get those objective ratings and to get the titles obligations enforced is to pass a bill that's been floating around Congress for a long time, hasn't been proposed for a while, but it's an amendment to the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act. It's the Professional Boxing Amendment Act. And what that does, it makes a federal, national U.S. Boxing Commission to oversee all the commissions. Something that people have talked about for decades as a dream, although a lot of the commissions oppose them, and various individuals oppose them because they're afraid what they would do. And that is they would clean up, they would exert influence over the sport. And one of the things the commission have is under that bill is they would have the right to look at all ratings that are submitted by the sanctioning organizations, look at all bouts proposed by the sanctioning organizations, and veto them if they don't fit the criteria of being objective. If the sanctioning organization can't defend a ranking, they can say that ranking system, that rating that you gave that boxer doesn't apply because there's no way that guy should move up so much. They could do the same for matches. That guy does not deserve a title fight. By the standards of the objective standards we're supposed to follow, that guy doesn't deserve that match. And that would change the sport drastically, because now you'd basically force the sanctioning organizations. In fact, a few of the sanctioning organizations might disappear, because any objective rating would probably make them obsolete, because they would have the same ratings. But you would get what we want, which is objective ratings and strict obligations enforced. And so we would have the fights I would like to see. I think we'd still have the great fights, but the titles would have sporting merit. We could still have any great wild fight we want that's a big pay-per-view draw. That Mayweather versus Pacquiao didn't need a title. We can still put those on as much as we want. But the sporting aspect of it, boxers, at least to the most part, would not be getting screwed like they have been.
So we would have our meritocracy.
We would have our meritocracy. We'd have a dream situation where we have independent titles and rankings, so the boxers could use those to retain their leverage. But the sanctioning organizations, we would have something to step in and say, you are not following your own rules. You are not objectively rating fighters. You're not making your champions follow the obligations and defend the titles against the worthy opponents. So you would have the titles would be on the sporting aspect would be preserved for the titles.
How close are we to either getting this or not getting this Boxers Amendment Act?
Probably not close at all. It hasn't been proposed for a while. Okay. It's one of the sad things that that when John McCain died, that it stopped being proposed. It was something after the Ali Act got passed that him and King from Iowa, the terrible, terrible congressman that thank God he's gone. But the one good thing he did, he kept pushing this bill. So maybe we can get some people supporting it. One thing I always find surprising is you see a lot of the members of not them, but the boxing media complain about the problems with boxing and how the Ali Act didn't fix it. But it's like a solution to fixing it was proposed, and yet for decades, no one seems to really since to support that bill. The bill that was to fix all the holes they spot in the Ali Act gets no support.
That's terrible.
Very sad.
Let's talk about what you would like to do or see done to fix MMA.
Well, again, we're flip side of the coin. A few things. I'll talk about the minor things that I think are very possible to happen, and then I'll go into which probably the bigger impact, but the harder to see happening. The first one is I would like to see the consensus ratings to come back, or the MMA Journalists Association have their own ratings, and see how the media sites use that. Instead of the Bellator rankings and the UFC rankings, have the media sites and the fans basically use an independent rankings as the ratings they look to all the time as where fighters should be ranked, instead of looking at the ones that the promoters put out. Because now the promoters are going to ignore them. There's nothing legal. But it would be nice to have something where if a fighter's in the UFC rated 3, he leaves the UFC and goes somewhere else, that when fans check out the ratings to see where fighters are rated, that he's still there and that he's no longer completely wiped out of the picture because he left the promotion. Same with Bellator, that we could see where people sit in the divisions across promotions. So that would wouldn't do a ton, but it would retain some sort. First, it would give us an idea of more meritocratic in the sense that you'd know where fighters lie in the division, but it would give some little bit of extra leverage to fighters because they wouldn't start from scratch going to a different promotion. Some fans, more hardcore, would know where they lie in the division because we saw that with the Strikeforce days. That, that's why there was a kind of a cry. The current Jake Shields might not make people think of this, but back in the day, there was a lot of interest in seeing Jake Shields go to the UFC because he was highly rated and they saw who he had beaten outside the UFC. To see him against GSP, there was an argument who was the number one welterweight, and that part of that was we had the hardcore fans were going to the sites and seeing these media ratings. The other thing I'd like to see is the promotions that do business in California follow California law, have their contract law be California, namely Bellator, but even the UFC, because Endeavor's based here. But California contract law says that a contract, no matter what, for a promotion cannot go past 5 years. So that would help to put some sort of sunset provision, a hard sunset provision on all contracts. So I would love if Bellator, instead of doing business out of, I think their contracts are based in New Jersey, said we're going to use, like old Strikeforce did, say we're using California as that's the legal jurisdiction for our contracts. And that would put a 5-year max on the contracts. And then the final would be hopefully Congress comes through and bans class action waivers and arbitration, which would kill what the UFC did, right? Which we talked about in an episode. Basically say that ploy that you did where you're making everybody sign a waiver no longer works. And that means the UFC would have to go back, if they're trying to defend themselves against antitrust lawsuits, go back and make their contracts less restrictive again and give us better contracts. But those are the easy one. The hard one that would do more is you would like to see maybe the antitrust lawsuit to win or go somewhere, and then the judge put a limit on the contract lengths, because the only way you're going to get more, I guess, leverage for fighters is either you have limited contracts or independent titles. So one would be the antitrust case going far enough that we get a ruling and the judge decides that they're going to put in they're going to limit one of the rules they're going to do is they're going to have some sort of limit to the contract lengths of the UFC. That'll be one of the rulings they give. And if that happened, a shorter contract, let's say 2 or 3 year contract, something that short, that would open up fighters the ability to use leverage when they leave. The other one would be expanding the Ali Expansion Act, Muhammad Ali Expansion Act, getting passed by Congress, which would basically, small rewriting, you can make it that it's in legally that a promoter, an MMA promoter, cannot have their own titles. So we'd introduce basically the sanction organizations, but it'd be independent titles and rankings, and that would give fighters a lot more leverage. And so those last two, we don't even have a class cert, and we haven't seen the Ali Act even submitted into Congress again. And so is there much momentum for that? Is there much support from fighters for the Ali Act expansion? I'm not certain.
All right, these answers seem dependent on things like the Ali Act and Congress actually doing something. Is there anything that the athletes can do on their own?
Well, there is, and this is kind of my dream scenario. And I'm not one, as you know, we are not one to tell fighters what to do, right? We don't want to, the direction they want to take, unions, association, Ali Act, not whatever. That's up to them, not us. But if we're talking my dream scenario, right? One thing both sides could do. Okay, for MMA it's a little harder because the boxers have the Ali Act already in place. They don't have the Professional Boxers Amendment Act, but they have the Ali Act. If boxers created an association, a bunch of boxers got together in an association, that would change everything. In fact, I talked to a bunch of people in boxing, and they said the big game changer was if you have the Ali Act and you have an association, no longer are you dependent on the Department of Justice. No longer are you dependent on the commissions to enforce the Ali Act. The boxers themselves could enforce the Ali Act, and they could enforce it and basically dictate to the sanction organizations that you have to follow your own guidelines and rules and make promoters start following the Ali Act. Now, for MMA, if fighters create an association, one good thing that they could do there is that they could use the association to lobby to get the Ali Act passed, right? I think if you had a large enough body of fighters that did it, maybe retired, you could get it passed because it would show, on my interview with Matt Stoller, we talked about this. You have to show Congress that there's a demand for it. And if enough big name fighters or small, whatever fighters in the UFC and Bellator or whatever showed up and expressed interest in it, it's very possible that you could get it to be passed. And if it got passed, you'd be in the same boat boxers are, where you have this tool, the Ali Act, which does some things, but it's never enforced really, except by private right of action. In other words, the boxers have to sue. But if you had an association, again, it's the game changer. If you have an association, you don't depend on the government to enforce it. You can file the association is standing, and they can enforce it themselves.
Sort of like they do in stick and ball sports.
Sort of, yes. It's very much. In fact, that leads to my dream scenario. And I've talked about this before with you. My dream scenario for both is the PGA Tour model, right? You familiar with golf, the PGA?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
And I know exactly where you're going with this.
Well, the PGA is a tour. It's a nonprofit. Players are members of it. And the tour, they're paying out 55% of the revenue. The tour itself, though it's a nonprofit, it controls the tournaments. It controls where the golf tournaments take, and they control a large sum of the money then. Well, I don't think the fighters could basically have their own promoter. Maybe in a real dream scenario, you'd have the fighters run their own promotion. But I don't think it would work. That's probably very, very unrealistic. But my dream scenario, if you have an association, if you have a legislation in place, the Ali Act, right, and you have an association that's willing to enforce it, well, instead of enforcing it on the sanctioning organizations who are just full of jackoffs who are just there to take money from the fighters, charging a 3% sanctioning fee, why not have the association create their own sanctioning organization? There's nothing in the Ali Act says that association can't have their own sanctioning organization. Promoters can't do it, right? There's a separation between them. Broadcasters can't. But the sanctioning organization, the fighters themselves, the boxers could create their own sanctioning organization. That sanctioning organization, after a while, you can mold it. That sanctioning organization, those sanctioning fees, maybe you get it from sponsors, whatever. That money, instead of being taken out of the fighter's pocket, could go back in their pocket as pensions, as health care, as you could set standards and rules that certain fighters on the undercard have to be paid a certain minimum. I mean, the PGA Tour, the new tour says that if you're on the tour, you can't if you make less than $500,000, they make up the difference. So everybody on the tour, all 220 golfers, make $500,000 minimum per year. You could set up standards where the minimum fees, the sanction organizing fees, maybe even demand that the promoters pay it. Those fees would go into pension funds and all the other stuff that fighters are always asking for, but it wouldn't come out of the fighter's pocket. And on top of that, they could defend the rules, the objective ratings, and the guidelines, so that fighters on both sides, boxers and MMA, have more leverage, because you're not worried about other promoters influencing the sanctioning organizations. And to me, that would be the best of all worlds.
Sounds like you've got this all mapped out.
Yeah, I think I should be getting a check from everybody tomorrow. send me a check. And no, but I mean, we talk about this on the show, so I've spent an inordinate amount of time about what could be done. Now, it's not very realistic, because as we've talked many times before, I wouldn't say it's unrealistic, because it is something that realistically could happen. It's plausible. This is something that fighters got together. If there's all the act in place, legislation, they can form their own sanctioning organization. All that stuff is in the realms of possibility. But the part that's hard to see is the nature of the fight business is that boxers and MMA fighters, the number of them, and it wouldn't take all of them. You just need enough of them to get the mass going. But even that seems impossible. You cannot get just enough fighters together, MMA fighters or boxers together. I mean, Jake Paul did a lot of talking. He stopped talking. But something like this, I'd like to see Jake. If Jake Paul was serious, I think he would do something more like this than trying to do a union, which, as much as I'm a pro-union guy, that seems much, much less realistic.
Well, there you have it, folks. John's dream plan. John, what do you got coming up?
Well, I'm hoping to have some articles. Nate Wilcox has been on me, even though, he will not accept my excuse that I had COVID and had family issues. So he wants me to get some stuff written. So we'll see if I can get it written about MMA and boxing. And on top of that, I don't even, if the shoe fits, I'm on that. If the shoe fits. And eventually, before the end of the year, me and Jacob Devitz are working on a book about the financial history of the UFC. The plan is to have that done and out before the end of the year. We're going to see how that goes.
There you have it, folks. So until next time, please stay safe.
It's not in the face! Thank you.